Hello, everybody. We are going to go ahead and open up this chapter on international political economy. It's going to be all about markets. Some of the key points for this chapter, we get into it here, just kind of my chapter outline. Here, it's going to include, the idea that markets are designed and implemented by people as tools to promote prosperity, and that there are different ways to design and implement markets. So, kind of starting off with the basic question. By the way, this lecture will be broken up into two parts. But just to discuss something pretty fundamental, what is political economy? Well, it's an interdisciplinary field that combines insights from political science, sociology, economics, and a little bit of psychology to help us better understand the relationship between politics and markets. Political economy, or global political economy, it's a pretty broad topic, and so this is very extensive, but it basically can be divided into two related subfields: comparative political economy and international political economy, or IPE. Some researchers focus more on comparative political economy, which examines differences between countries in their choice of policies and economic systems that shape their domestic markets. And these scholars focus on economics inside the state, including topics like comparative wealth, poverty, inequality, and differences in political economic systems. The related political science subfield of international relations, or IR, has their own version of global political economy, reflecting the IR focus on relations between countries across states rather than within them. They tend to focus on economic forces that connect different states. So things like international trade, global capital flows, and other aspects of globalization, such as communication, interconnectedness, transportation networks, etc. Those are kind of the common areas of study. And so some IPE scholars are also interested in understanding why and when conflict arises between countries that are fighting over natural resources. Given that domestic and international markets are inherently connected, there's a great deal of overlap between comparative and IR approaches. But most of economic development or comparative scholars, they generally point out that trade interconnectedness is just one of the main reasons that countries like China and India have had such phenomenal growth in recent years, while trade IR scholars are increasingly discussing how the rise of populist politicians in some countries is challenging the international trade system. They're taking down those systems like NAFTA and others. And so, you know, we can look at major international organizations that give loans to countries in currency crisis, and then compare those with populist politics. And it's a pretty important shift in the global political economy. So, in terms of markets, they are the conduit or the median through which buyers and sellers exchange goods. We've been a part of that, probably a marketplace, Facebook Marketplace, if you've ever, or Craigslist, posted something for sale when you're moving out of, an apartment that you've had or a home, and you no longer need the goods that you are currently, in possession of, because you're going to update and get new stuff. You post it, somebody gives you an offer, you either accept it or reject it, right? And that's a very individual market. It's very micro, but we're talking about sort of in many instances macroeconomics. But sellers, want to create products that will be in demand. If you create something that's not in demand, then you're going to go out of business. It's not going to be very successful. Um, we've seen where people have been rejected for their products in Shark Tank and things of that nature, right? Buyers are seeking to buy the best or most goods at the lowest price. They want to get the lowest price, but they want to get good quality stuff too. They don't want to have to repurchase an item over and over again, generally, unless it's something that is disposable, like a razor or something or a toothbrush, right? They want to get a good quality product. If you're talking about tools, right, you don't want to have to replace your impact driller if you're in construction once every year or two. You want to have that impact driller last you for 5, 10 years, right? So they are always going to seek the cheapest price. And then lastly, markets emerge spontaneously and are not easily controlled by the state. Some things just, they gain a lot of traction in a very short period of time, and sometimes, oftentimes, to the bewilderment of people. Um, Currently, it's interesting to note the fashion industry, athleisure wear, has really gone up. When you look at these companies like Fiore or Lululemon, they've exploded. Look at the stock price of Lululemon; it's like three to $400 is kind of the range of where it trades, and that's maybe to the bewilderment of some market analysis. But okay, I'm getting a little bit off track. Let's get back to the topic of markets and property. Um, all economies are composed of markets and property in one shape or in form, in some sort of form, one way or another. Markets are arenas that allow people to trade property and they exchange ownership. The main actors in markets are sellers, those who create the products, they create the supply, and buyers who seek to purchase those products are creating and driving the demand. Markets emerge spontaneously. They can be difficult, if not impossible, for states to manage due to multiple actors that are engaging with them. And property is a unique kind of aspect. It's a socially defined relationship and institution. It differentiates the rights of owners from the rights of non owners. And so, in other words, I'm allowed to do things with my sandwich that I'm not allowed to do with your sandwich because I have ownership over mine and not yours, right? That's a very elementary way of looking at things, but nevertheless, it's still a pretty good one that you can connect with, right? Property can be owned privately by an individual, like the sandwich example, or someone's home, or ownership can be held publicly. So you can think of examples of goods and services, some that are tangible or intangible. A sandwich, a haircut, that's a tangible thing. But a piece of software code, um, or a family recipe, that's more intangible. And so the backdrop of all this, you might want to um, think about the implications for intellectual property issues. The modern high tech economy is dominated by questions of who has ownership over intangible property, like algorithms, computer code, and software design. And in a lot of ways, old copyright laws are really struggling to stay up to date and keep up. With artificial intelligence on the rise, things like ChatGPT, which I'm sure you're all aware of, this is going to be an area where countries will be spending more and more time combating these types of things, or more and more time thinking about these areas of AI. Intellectual property law was created to protect individuals and companies who put time into research and development, and that would guarantee that they would have the right to be the sole people profiting from their invention for a certain period of time. In the United States, the average length of a patent ownership is about 20 years. And that means that the developer has the sole ownership of an intellectual property, IP, and the sole right to profit from this for about 20 years, which, is an eternity in the tech world. In recent times, we've seen the emergence of patent trolls, which is really a derogatory term referring to companies who file a patent with a relevant government office, but they really have no intention of ever developing that product or service. So instead, what they'll do is they'll use these patents to file lawsuits against other companies who are developing the actual products and services. And the result of that is that productive companies are forced to pay large amounts of money to these entities. Their estimates are several billion per year in the United States alone, with some going out of business, which is pretty unfortunate. And the result of this lost competition is that goods become significantly more expensive to consumers. Well, let's talk about the companies passing uh, the the price of doing business onto the consumer. If a company gets taxed, then they just factor that into the price of the product they sell. So oftentimes that happens. So possible, how do we combat this these sort of patent trolls, as they're called? Well, possible solutions you might want to think about um, are shortening the patent length for tech related products. One could introduce a use it or lose it clause in patent laws. That would reform the litigation process so that judges are given more leeway in terms of interpreting patent rights, or having a government committee available to review cases of blatant patent trolling and leveling fines, heavy handed fines, I would say, against those companies, with the fines going to reimburse the company's victims. And so you might want to think about the benefits and drawbacks of these solutions. um, this is a little bit related, not so related to the patent troll stuff, but Apple and Samsung made major patent wars going back and forth between those two companies, where Apple had essentially won out. I know Samsung's the big producer of Android phones, but it's an interesting case study to take a look at, if any of you want to, take a look at the legal proceedings of those two companies when they were having these big, kind of patent lawsuits going back and forth between, Cupertino and Seoul, South Korea, where Samsung is. Pretty interesting stuff happening there. That was several years ago though. So, anyways, okay, so let's take a look at goods and services. Okay, yes, we are on the right track here. Generally, goods and services fall into these two general types: public goods and private goods, depending on whether the product is excludable or non-excludable, and whether consumption of the good reduces its availability. More on the private goods part in a bit, but let's first go ahead and introduce the vocabulary concept of public goods. All states and governments, they provide their population with some form of public good. At the very least, government is supposed to protect their population from external and internal threats. So national defense and police are generally, we know those as public goods, at least from the American context, and many other governments around the world. We would see it in that context as well. But governments who are building roads and providing at least a primary education, um, which are available for all citizenry to access and use, again, those would be considered um, public goods, as we have there. The quality of these public good offerings will be dependent on the relative government capacity in order to carry that out. Healthcare is an interesting issue, especially in the United States. It's generally treated as a private good, even with some recent reforms. Not everyone is, provided access to it. In other wealthy Western economies like Canada, healthcare is seen as a public good, with the state paying for publicly owned hospitals and universal benefits for all citizens. So we've got to, sort of break these two things down of private versus public goods, um, covering the big differences between those. Private goods, which we're shifting the conversation to here, are excludable. It is possible to prevent someone else from eating your sandwich, as the earlier example I gave. Consumption reduces, right? If I eat a sandwich, there's less sandwich left for you to eat. Markets are good at providing private goods. Why is that? Well, a consumer who wants the good has to pay for it, someone else to make it. To get the good, he or she must be willing to pay enough to make it worth someone else's time to produce it. So, for profit entities are really going to flourish in this kind of environment. Public goods, on the other hand, non excludable. It's not possible to prevent someone else from seeing your lighthouse and thereby successfully navigating around dangerous rocks. Or fresh air could be an example of a public good as well. You can't hog all the fresh air in the United States, if that was a thing. Although Canada does sell bottled air to China, that is a real thing that takes place. So maybe fresh air is becoming a private good, at least when we think about it globally, in a country like China where pollution is rampant and you have the parts per million, reaching upwards of 8 or 900, which is really unhealthy kind of air to be breathing in. I lived over in China for a year, worked there, and definitely have firsthand experience with it. But getting back to the conversation on public goods, when we're discussing consumption and we compare it to private goods, the consumption aspect does not reduce it. If I see and benefit from a lighthouse, there is the same amount of lighthouse left for everyone else to benefit from. Um, so markets are not good at providing public goods. Markets are good at providing private goods, but the public good thing is a little more complicated. A consumer who wants the good doesn't have to pay somebody else to make it. To get the good, he or she simply free rides off of someone else's production or purchase. Once someone builds a road, every car, truck can use it to get where they want to go or need to go. So, for profit entities fail to make ends meet in this sort of environment, i.e., they go out of business, meaning that only government or nonprofits who focus on providing services rather than profiting from those services can feasibly operate in a public goods kind of a scenario. Okay, let's get into some of the other aspects of political economy. Money is pretty useful because people can, you know, take it upon themselves to use it to trade things. Now, if they're trading things, sometimes the government has a tough time taxing that when individuals trade with one another or sell a good, right? Versus walking into a department store. I use the example of Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist, and you want to sell something that you're no longer using. Say it's a desk. Well, if you sell that on Marketplace and somebody purchases it for $60, there's no tax that the government is collecting on that. Versus walking into an IKEA store, you're going to have state and local tax dollars associated with that purchase. But without money, we would have to barter for everything, right? Which is essentially the kind of scenario that I'm discussing. And there are some inefficiencies with bartering. Um, in the store with money, you can wait until later to buy something if you want to. You can wait for it to go on sale. With money, you know how much wealth you have, that sort of thing. That's a good kind of way to look at it, I guess. And in the modern era, money has no intrinsic value of its own, while currencies were historically pegged to a precious metal, often gold or silver, with a harder value. Economists generally agree that this is infeasible for modern economies to have the dollar backed by gold, the gold standard. That went away several decades ago. But instead, the value of money largely rests in the trust in the government who produces it. They print the money, and in trust that others will accept that this currency has value. Right now, the global currency is the US dollar. People are after US dollars, but that's some might argue that it's being challenged by Bitcoin. And I'll get into the Bitcoin stuff in just a second. But at the very least, the government accepts that its own money, they accept that their own money as payment for goods and services, and that acts as a currency sink. You can pay your taxes with your own government's currency, which gives government printed currency an inherent value that your monopoly money, really sort of lacks. In recent years, there's been a rise in online currencies like Bitcoin, which are neither produced by governments nor are exchangeable for a hard good like gold. And so you might want to think about the economic risks of currency that lacks any government oversight or protections and any potential economic benefits. Again, Bitcoin's not being backed by anything necessarily. Usually, when you deposit your money into a bank account, it's backed. A lot of times, it's backed up to the FDIC kind of stuff. $250,000 as a max amount uh, to have your deposits. But really, you might want to. This is, I think, a moment in the lecture where it could be beneficial to reflect on Bitcoin's influence around the world. We've recently had the president of El Salvador announce that they will be heavily investing in Bitcoin and using a lot of Bitcoin around this small country in Central America. And El Salvador has mined nearly 700, or excuse me, 474 Bitcoins to be exact, since 2021. And that's been fueled by a volcano geothermal power plant, and official data has brought the government's total Bitcoin portfolio to roughly $354 million at current prices. Again, keep in mind that Bitcoin is it's gonna fluctuate week to week, day to day, month to month. But Bitcoin, it's not regulated by any central bank, which that really complicates matters for states and that wish to track taxation and control their reserves, among other things. So since I've kind of I've mentioned the central bank, let's go ahead and take a look at that for a moment. In the United States and most other advanced economies, there's generally a central bank that's involved. For the US, it's our Federal Reserve Board, and they effectively choose how much money will be available for people to use. Banks help control the amount of currency in the market by doing things like setting interest rates. It's been a big deal in recent times here with when you set interest rates for home buying, that has a major impact on the housing market. Interest rates overall actually affect different things like purchasing a car. And so if you're buying a used car from a dealership, the rates are varying depending on how good your credit score is and how much money you have in the. I mean, there's a lot of different factors that determine it. But when you're purchasing a car and interest rates are anywhere from 9 to 12%, that's going to affect the supply and demand and how quickly things are selling. But a state central bank is setting that interest rate on their loans. Most private banks adopt their own policy. And so when interest rates are high, loans are more expensive, money's tight, and it's tough to get out because you have to pay more back on the interest. But by keeping money in a savings account, yields are a much better payoff, particularly right now too with certificates of deposit, CDs. Those are paying really great rates right now, around 5.2, 5.3%. And then of course that rate is going to fluctuate on how many months you are purchasing that coupon for. And so people take their money out of circulation, they put it in the bank. In an ideal world, a central bank would respond to an overheated economy or a bubble economy by raising interest rates. And so, in contrast, when interest rates are low, loans are cheap, money's loose, savings have less rewards, money markets might have less rewards. Um, and so, as a result, spending increases, meaning that the amount of money running through markets increases. This is one reason why lowering interest rates is considered an economic stimulus policy. And central banks try to find a balance between too little and too much money flowing, because either can either end of the extreme part of that can lead to a lot of different economic problems. And so, money is created by the state's treasury agency, but then issued as currency to banks, often through a central bank. And these banks then lend and distribute it to their customers. Those customers then exchange their money with each other, buying and selling goods and services, which helps to maintain a currency based economy. Um, Supply and demand also apply to a country's currency. And so, as a result, by managing monetary flows, a central bank can shape the value of that currency in an open market. When we look at things like inflation, if there's too much money circulating, but the same amount of goods and services are, then the value of money will decline. To it won't be worth as much, and there will be more money to spend on the same number of goods. So prices of goods will go up. All of us are familiar with that based on our own experience with things going up currently. People on low incomes or fixed incomes, like pensions or retirees or people who rely on Social Security, they tend to be especially hit very hard as their wages fail to keep up with inflationary pressures and those prices on the goods that they ultimately need to purchase in order to survive. So you think about heating oil in the winter. um, More generally speaking, you think about, for these people who are on fixed incomes, things like their electrical bill, their groceries, their gas, to get to and from the stores, or just to get around in general, right? Those are much difficult, more challenging to handle because their income's not changing. I think that's pretty straightforward and easy to understand. And so, as a result, poverty significantly increases under periods of inflation, which is what we're experiencing right now. And so, on the other end of the extreme, there are things like hyperinflation, which occurs when there is an extreme rise in the amount of money circulating. It can effectively undermine money as a source of value. And just to highlight an example, we talked about Zimbabwe in this class a little bit, and their inflation in November. I know we're taking this back a little bit, but for November of 2008, prices were doubling every 24 hours, which is just a crazy thing to think about. Um, I don't know how in that country. I've never traveled to Zimbabwe, but walking into a store and having to like change the prices, or like not knowing, you can't budget or plan for anything like that. Another extreme case of hyperinflation was in Venezuela in 2018, 10 years after Zimbabwe was experiencing this, where prices were doubling every 24 hours. Venezuela had 80,000% inflation every year. And that was very problematic for them to have. And so this is a hyperinflation crisis. Venezuela's economic choices have created considerable economic instability. The economy initially seemed to flourish under Hugo Chavez, um, and currently the president is Nicolas Maduro. But under Chavez, because it was growing, that was predominantly due to a significant boom in global oil prices, where oil prices were going to 110, $120 a barrel, and that's why they were doing so well. They are an oil-rich country, but once those prices went back down to $55, $60 a barrel. Currently, they're around $78, $79 a barrel, $80 a barrel. Once they went down, though, the fiscal mismanagement became very apparent for Venezuela. And as the economic crisis sparked a political one, it triggered U.S. sanctions, and Venezuela ultimately spiraled into state failure. So let's talk about having too much money or too little money that's flowing. Too little money that's flowing in your economy. This is known as deflation. And so if there's not enough money circulating in the economy, then it means that the value of the money increases, allowing people to buy more things with less money. This sounds like a really good thing, but it reduces profits from these transactions. And when people or companies see less profits, they start laying off workers, which, people getting laid off, then we see the unemployment rate rise and cutting back on plans to expand their businesses, which that further decreases spending. And so, according to many economists, although there are some that disagree, this has been a major contributing factor to the economic crisis that started around 2008, 2009. Okay, when we get into sort of the regulating markets, all states regulate exchanges in some ways. In most countries, it is illegal to sell tainted food. Food's got to be inspected. Some services and goods can be illegal, such as gambling, prostitution, and many drugs. Um, but there are black markets for these things. If we're going to do things in a legal way, then we, have to take those aspects into consideration. But other regulations govern how businesses operate. Democracies especially tend to make it illegal to employ workers in needlessly unsafe conditions in factories where they may get injured frequently, or to allow businesses to employ child labor, those people who are maybe under the age of 18 or 16, depending on where you live. But Uzbekistan, for instance, has been criticized for employing forced labor in its cotton production, an action that has sponsored international criticism and a movement toward regulations preventing this from happening. As for other regulations, a state may prevent firms from becoming monopolies or encourage state regulated monopolies in areas of national interest. A monopoly is a situation in which one firm is the only seller of a certain good. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan broke up several famous U.S. monopolies. That would be AT&T and Pan Am Airlines. Pan Am ultimately went out of business. Um, they seemed to be kind of unstoppable at one point, but that led to the creation of more competitive industries composed of many companies. You might be familiar with some of these companies today, more competition amongst companies like Sprint, Verizon, Delta, American Airlines, just to name a few of those. Several monopolies still exist in the United States. Many utilities, such as electricity, water, cable services, those are monopolies in local areas, as are professional sports, the NFL, MLB, NBA, and the Amtrak rail service that's connected to our government. But those, we can think of the electricity services as being monopoly. PG&E. I mean, at least in Northern California, we don't have a choice. If you want to get electricity, you have to go through PG&E. There is no other electrical competitor to that. Um, and so sometimes these monopolies make sense. For instance, having multiple competing rail companies would require significantly more track space and infrastructure investment than is practical or maybe even feasible. Although there's a company that is trying to lay track for a high-speed rail between LA and Las Vegas. That's been in the works for a number of years, though. There are other times, though, where these monopolies are able to maintain on their own by themselves. despite the damage that is done to consumers, though very effective lobbying efforts have been made. So again, PG&E, we can think about, the campfire and things that they have done to damage consumers, and they're still operating, right, with no competition. Edison is a competitor, but they're mostly in Southern California, from my understanding. And so let's go ahead and move on to trade here. All states have some limits on cross-border commerce. You might think of companies, having protectionist measures. There are limits on the trade of goods and services. The rise of international financing and currency trade has increased government regulations over capital, over capital trade. China's decision to increase capital controls in recent years, for instance, has made it more difficult for foreign companies to operate in China, but it's also made it more difficult for Chinese companies to begin or expand overseas projects. Um, we must also think about tariffs, where you have EVs, electric vehicles in the United States. For instance, Tesla and Rivian are that, well, there's not much competition with Rivian, but Tesla at least is the major EV maker that we think of in the United States. Well, China is starting this EV that's being sold for about $10,000 a unit, and BYD, um, and you know, uh, the United States has talked about slapping a 100% tariff on any EVs imported from China to protect American EVs. And so, anyways, that is an interesting thing to kind of take a look at as well. All right. Comparative advantage. Is an area that can emerge for a number of reasons. The United States traditionally has a comparative advantage in agricultural production, especially grains and meat. This is due to a combination of favorable climate, cheap land, a lot of land, resource endowments, right, and extensive agricultural technology. And it's further helped by agricultural policies like extensive crop insurance, which shields U.S. farmers from the crop failure, bankruptcy issues that are seen in developing countries. Germany has a comparative advantage in high tech manufacturing, including complex robotics. This sector in Germany, at least, it thrives quite a bit because of the extensive social welfare state that creates a highly skilled technical workforce. And at the other end of the economic scale, Bangladesh and Vietnam have emerged as major garment manufacturers because of their cheap labor force, which allows them to produce goods at a fraction of the cost compared to more wealthy economies. 2018, Bangladesh announced a 51% wage increase from approximately $63 per month to 90 US dollars per month. And since Bangladesh garment workers work anywhere from 60 to 70 hours, sometimes more per week, this translates into less than 50 cents per hour. If you look at it, if it's translated into American money, um, pretty good money in their own country, but much less than would be needed to financially survive in the U.S. to be sure. Um, Also, there's no, when you look at the garment industry and fires that take place in these garment factories, it's pretty tragic. But not a lot of regulation in terms of unions that are created there in those countries are available to those workers, paid time off, healthcare benefits, dental benefits, vision benefits. I mean, none of that, to my knowledge, exists. I'm not sure what the landscape looks like for, those garment workers who would get a paid lunch, breaks, just the conditions, the regulations are it's unregulated from what I've seen. And then when there are things like fires or major accidents and people die, There's no compensation to the families, and so again, there's a lot of unfortunate things that are associated with this. But as in terms of Americans, it's very difficult to pick up a piece of clothing and read a tag that says "Made in America." If you did, then your sweatshirt, might cost you $100, $120. And so it allows for people around the world to purchase cheap clothing. Things like companies like H&M have been accused of this fast fashion model. Try to say that 100 times, right, or 10 times. But yeah, just cheaply made, articles of clothing. Yeah, that's certainly what's happening. And so there's a discussion that you might be thinking about on your own as we cover that comparative advantage aspects of political economy. So let's take arguments for over the regulation of trade. Um, who regulates trade? Well, to generate state revenue, foster local industry, to protect local jobs, and to keep wealth in the country. Why not? Why would you not want to regulate trade? Well, to promote competition, to keep the costs of good low, and to stimulate domestic innovation in areas of comparative advantage. Before I get to that, actually, I think this is probably a pretty good stopping point for us at this moment before we dive into political economic systems. Um, these these different classifications we talked about in a political sense under their identity aspect and political ideologies. So now we're going to talk about how these classifications are related to economics in the second half.